And there we go. All right. Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Eleanor Rangers, and this is our History in Our Backyard webinar series. And I'd like to welcome you all this evening. We are a small nonprofit organization that's been in existence actually for 15 years, almost 16 years. And we have been dedicated to preserving Cold War related history from the greater Southeastern Pennsylvania region, which includes both Cold War and slash space race. And this evening, as you know, we do have a space race themed topic. I also want to mention, as I've been teasing for the last couple of months, that we were thinking about doing some sort of thing to celebrate the well, I can never pronounce it, the semi-quincentennial, which is America 250, our 250th birthday next year. And I do want to mention two things, actually. There's a gentleman that contacted me about a month and a half ago who is working on a documentary called Before the Moon, about aerospace heritage in the greater Philadelphia region. So I've been helping to advise him on that content. So he is in process of just starting to get that up and running. So I will make sure to keep everyone informed about that. And also something that I've decided to initiate is the development of a Greater Philadelphia Aerospace Hall of Fame. Believe it or not, the state of Pennsylvania does not have its own Aviation Hall of Fame or Aerospace Hall of Fame. So I've decided that we can start small. We can focus on the Greater Philadelphia region, which has a very rich heritage in aviation and space flight history. So we will be providing more information soon. I probably will have a nomination process and voting process so I can involve the public, but we should be planning some type of somewhat informal induction ceremony more towards this time next year. So more details to come on that, but if you also have any thoughts about potential nominees, definitely shoot us an email and we're happy to consider it. Again, our webinar. I do want to mention, as always being a small nonprofit organization, that we certainly always welcome donations. And I do want to thank anyone who has donated to our organization. That the donations strictly go towards bringing programs like this to you guys, and also with some of our historical preservation efforts. We do keep our webinars actually on our YouTube channel. I do try to update that periodically with other Cold War related or space race related videos of interest that I may come across. So definitely worth checking it out periodically. I also maintain a Facebook page where we basically just put our program announcements and maybe some other related items of interest on there as well. We also just started a MeWe page. And if any of you are on MeWe, on that social media platform, we do have a presence there as well. I also want to mention kind of a little bit of sad news very briefly. This gentleman by the name of Bobby Pietrangelo used to come to our programs before the pandemic, and he would come to our programs at the Fusion Warminster. He was a high school kid, Eagle Scout, loved everything about World War II history, Cold War history. He was just a very enthusiastic young gentleman. Unfortunately, he actually passed away at the young age of 23. After he graduated from high school, he decided he wanted to actually do humanitarian work in Ukraine and ended up in Ukraine in 2022, ultimately in the Ukrainian army at the end of last year, and unfortunately he was killed in action on January 3rd, 2025. And I did want to just mention this because he was someone local who did attend our programs, and we have added him to our Veterans Commemorative Hall of Fame page as well. So if anyone is interested, I know there's a couple of events coming up locally to the Warminster area to pay tribute to Bobby. And if you have any interest, definitely reach out to me and I can forward you information. We do have a number of other events coming up through the latter part of the year. In August, we have Chris Sturdivant and Gary Powers talking about Cold War Virginia, a new book that they both co-authored together. And then a number of other pretty interesting talks. And we will be having a Veterans Tribute event this year. More to come on that, but I do have a pretty interesting speaker I'm pretty excited about that we will be announcing sometime in the near future. And this again is our Cold War Virginia presentation. One thing I just want to note, we are not going to be able to live stream this, unfortunately. The gentleman that usually helps me with audiovisual will be on vacation, so I will not be able to live stream this. But for those of you that are local to Warminster, you will be able to obviously see the presentation. So without further ado, let me go ahead and introduce our guest speaker this evening, Stephen Walker, who has spoken on this webinar before, and we're grateful to have him return. Stephen was born in London, is a bachelor's of art and history from Oxford, and a master's in the history of science from Harvard. And Stephen is an award-winning documentary filmmaker as well as writer. His films have won BAFTAs, an Emmy, Royal Television Society Awards, and Europe's most prestigious documentary prize, the Rose d'Or. And I've included images of two of his books, which he has spoken about here on the webinar. They also are archived on our YouTube page if you had interest in viewing those. So this evening, we have Stephen back to talk about another cosmonaut by the name of Titov. So I am going to switch over to his slides and hand the podium over to Stephen.
Thanks very much indeed. I hope everybody can hear me properly. I'm speaking from London, England, and it is, what is it now? It is 25 to 1 in the morning. So bear with me, but I'm awake and alert, and I'm keen to tell you a little bit about this extraordinary story to do with this quite amazing man, Gherman Titov, who was Russia's or the Soviet Union's second cosmonaut, and the one that nobody really remembers today. Let's just put the first picture up and get going with it. If we can go to picture number 1 and get on, can we get that full screen? Is that possible?
There we
go. That's perfect. Superb. So this is a picture that many people might recognize. It's just to set the story. This is April the 12th, 1961. It's about 7 o'clock in the morning. We are in Kazakhstan at the Soviet Cosmodrome of Baikonur, and we're on a bus, and the bus is taking that fan we see there, Yuri Gagarin, into the history books. He's on his way to the launch of Vostok 1 to become shortly the first human being in space, and to be, at least for many, many years, and certainly immediately after that flight, probably the most famous human on the planet. But what I'm interested in tonight is the man who is sitting behind him, that you can see sort of blurred in the orange suit, and that is Gherman Titov. Gherman Titov, the number 2. Gherman Titov, the also ran. Gherman Titov, the almost famous. He is, I like to think, the Soviet Buzz Aldrin. He's the one who got there second and lived with the reality of that and the impact of that for the rest of his life, with, in many respects, quite similar psychological impacts that happened with Buzz as well. He is the eternal number 2, but his story is really utterly fascinating, and it has almost Shakespearean epic proportions to it, as we will see. If we can go to picture number 2. There he is on the left, Gherman Titov, handsome and smiling, and there on the right is Yuri Gagarin. And what makes this story so compelling, really, is that it is a story of 2 friends, because these men were the best of friends, as we will see, the closest of friends, and they were also the greatest of rivals. Only one of them could end up being the first man to travel in space, the first human to travel in space. And as we shall see, the decision as to which one of these men would walk into the history books was only made 3 days before Yuri Gagarin, finally took that flight and took that step. He was the man who circled the Earth once on that fateful day of April the 12th, 1961, while Gherman Titov waited on the ground. 4 months later, in August 1961, Titov would make his own flight, which was actually far more ambitious than Gagarin's. He would orbit the Earth 17 times. He would be in space for over 25 hours. And remember, this was all happening at a time when in the United States, in the Mercury program, the only two space flights that had happened up to that point were Alan Shepard's and Gus Grissom's, both of which were suborbital flights that lasted each about 15 minutes. So this is an extraordinary achievement. And there were a number of other firsts associated to this flight, which have long been forgotten about, which I shall resurrect. And yet, who remembers Gherman Titov today? Let's look at the next picture. So here we are again, the greatest of friends, and it could have been so different. And this is why I say there's a Shakespearean element to this story, this intense competition, this deep friendship, this spectacular achievement, and also tragedy. And it's one that's also interspersed with some quite blackly comedic moments, as we shall see. It's not a story that many people know. I think it's a hell of a tale. So let's dive deep into it and tell that story. We'll start at the beginning, really. If we can go to picture number 4, the next picture. He's born here, Titov, in the most extraordinarily beautiful part of the Soviet Union, of Russia. We're in Siberia, in an area called the Altai territory. It's incredibly sparsely populated. It's incredibly beautiful. It is extremely remote. We're talking about somewhere that is about 2,500 miles to the east of Moscow. Even today, I checked on Google Maps, and it would take a car 48 hours just to drive from Moscow to this place. I've actually been to Siberia. I was invited to a film festival with a movie I directed some years back in Novosibirsk, which is the capital of Siberia. Let me tell you, this place is really off the map weird and remote. So it's a place of bears, mountains, goodness knows what, tundra and trees. It's the area where Titov was brought up, is an area roughly the size of Hungary or Poland, but it has a population of about the same as, say, Allentown. So it's really sparsely populated. If you go to the next picture, please. He was born in 1935 in September, and this is a terribly poor quality picture, which was actually taken from his so-called autobiography, which is called 700,000 Kilometers Through Space, which is actually edited by, and frankly written by, journalists from Pravda, the propagandistic, which still exists, newspaper in Russia, back in the early 1960s after he had made his famous flight, famous then. And so the quality of the images is very Soviet, as you can see, very touched up. But you can get a sense. It's a collective farm. It's in sort of the middle of nowhere, as I was saying. And he was born there in one of those kind of cabins in a little collective village where his father was a school teacher. And the fact that he was born in this part of Russia, of the Soviet Union, in Siberia, and the fact that his father was a school teacher were going to be things that counted against him in later life when the key decision was going to be made about who was going to fly that famous flight in April 1961. A third issue was his name. He was called Gherman, and we'll come back to what the problem was with that was later on. But it was an odd name to have, and in fact, it was named after a character, a lead character in a famous story by Alexander Pushkin, the famous 19th century playwright and poet. In fact, if we go to our next slide, I've got a picture of Pushkin, called the Queen of Spades. And the reason why he was called Gherman, is this character is named Gherman in this story, the Queen of Spades, is his father loved Pushkin, was obsessed with Pushkin and Pushkin's writings, and he passed that obsession on to his son Gherman. Gherman was obsessed with Pushkin and obsessed with quoting Pushkin. He knew huge chunks of this stuff by heart, in a way that sat somewhat at odds with his kind of career as a pilot and as a cosmonaut, as we shall see. And it would also lead him into trouble in ways that we will find out shortly. If we go to the next picture, please. His father, Stepan Titov, the teacher, is in the middle there. Next to him is looking very Russian, is his mother, Alexandra, and then his sister behind, sitting actually by the bank of a river in this place where they grew up. In the Second World War, his father was away in the war. He survived the war, but he was away during the war. But the family was brought up in very straitened circumstances. But they were not occupied by Nazi Germany. They were far too far east. And this, again, is very different from Yuri Gagarin. Yuri Gagarin was actually brought up in an area of Russia which was southwest of Moscow that was overrun by the Nazis after the invasion of June 1941 in Operation Barbarossa, when the Nazis, on the largest front in history, invaded the Soviet Union. And actually, for Yuri Gagarin, it was an utterly traumatic experience in which he was kicked out of his home. And at one point, his brother, younger brother, aged 8, Boris, was hanged and nearly died by an SS officer who just took some sort of dislike to this small Russian child. So Gagarin went through the experience of occupation by the Nazis. Titov had none of that experience at all. He was thousands of miles behind the front lines, but his father wasn't there. He had to sort of become the man of the family, even as a child. And he developed this extraordinary resilience that was going to be very important to him, very valuable to him, a real asset to him in later life. Actually, as a teenager, after the war, he had a terrible bike accident and smashed his wrist, breaking a lot of bones in his wrist. But somehow himself, without seeing doctors, he managed to rehabilitate that wrist. And in fact, in his subsequent series of medicals, both at the Air Force and ultimately when he became a cosmonaut, somehow he managed to hide this injury and the impact of this injury from all of those medics and doctors in a way that's really quite remarkable, given the intensity of the medical scrutiny that he found himself under. So he was resilient, he was clever, he was musical, he was poetic, and he also had another obsession, which was flying. And if we go to the next picture, please. Here he is, aged, I think, 20 years old. Again, one of those Sovietized, terrible, kind of touched up pictures. But I kind of like them in a way because they have their sort of special style, which is quite distinctive. He joined the Soviet Air Force. It was his great dream to fly airplanes, and particularly to fly jets, and particularly to fly fighter jets. And he got his wish. And if we go to the next picture, please, he found himself flying the famous MiG-15 Russian fighter, jet fighter, which was remarkably kind of revolutionary in its day. And in fact, many of these aircraft flew against F-86 Sabres in the Korean War. And this was a mainstay of the Soviet Air Force in the 1950s. By the time that Titov was flying this aircraft, it was already becoming somewhat obsolete, but he loved it. He loved the flying. He was a very good pilot. He was stationed with a unit somewhere near Leningrad, and certain qualities became very evident. He was an excellent pilot. His intelligence was noted by his instructors and by his squadron leaders, but he could also be very outspoken, and he was hot-headed, and in a very un-Soviet way, very distinctively different from Yuri Gagarin, as we shall see. He was somebody who was always questioning authority. He wasn't very communal either, in a way that was very much encouraged within the Soviet system. And at one point, it got so bad, and he took on his superiors so openly, that he was very nearly kicked out of the Air Force and kicked out of his career and his dream as a pilot. But what saved him was that he was just too good to lose. He was just too good to lose. And this left his instructors scratching their heads. You know, he had all these contradictory qualities, and it wouldn't be for the first time that they would be scratching their heads. So we go to the next picture. Forgive me, this is a picture which I was going to put in, which is him actually with a group of his cadets training. Difficult to recognize. He's in the middle row on the very far right. I couldn't recognize him till it's pointed out. It's from the same propaganda book that I mentioned that was edited by Pravda. And again, very different from most of his squadron colleagues because of this sort of slightly crusty, slightly rebellious side, which was not encouraged, and particularly not in the Soviet Union, and particularly not in the Soviet Union military, and particularly not in the Soviet Union military at that time, at the height of the Cold War in the 1950s. But he survived, he kept going, he kept flying. And if we go to the next picture, please. In the spring of 1958, he met his wife, Tamara, a beautiful woman. She was Ukrainian, interestingly. She was a cook. I interviewed her when I wrote my book, Beyond. She was living in Moscow, and we had a wonderful afternoon, actually, with lots and lots of cake. This was at a time when one could go to Russia. This is in 2019, 2020. And she was very delightful and still quite obviously passionately in love with her husband, who had long since passed away. She was also very candid in a way that was unexpected in some respects. She described how she first met him at a dance when he was stationed in Leningrad, and he was still wearing his boots and his flying jacket at the dance, and he didn't dance very well. But she said he was a handsome guy, and she said he was also very persistent. He didn't hang around. And within 4 months of their meeting for the very first time, they were married. He was, she said to me, a man that was impulsive in everything and not afraid to speak his mind. In fact, she said to me, and this is a direct quote, he was not afraid of anything. Meantime, in the outside world, if we go to the next picture, please, things in the space world were happening. Sorry, we can go one from that. That's him as a pilot. If we go one after that. Famous picture, wonderful picture. I love this picture. This is the Mercury 7, dressed up in their magnificent spacesuits before any of them had stepped foot inside a capsule and flown in space. We're in 1959, in April of that time. You will probably know that there was a press conference in Washington where the Mercury 7 were introduced to the world after a fantastically complicated and very, very intensive selection process. They became an overnight sensation. These 7 guys were the best test pilots in America, supposedly. They were willing to risk life and limb to beat the Russians into space at the very height of the Cold War. They were essentially Cold War warriors. And if we go to the next picture, we see the impact of their fame. Famously, they had a deal with Life magazine. Here they are on Life magazine grinning, and they should be grinning, but I mean, they became instant celebrities way before any of them had been in space, and famous right the way across the world. Now, at this point, the Soviet Union had no human space program at all, none. Even though they had famously put the first satellite, Sputnik, into space sometime earlier, before the United States managed to do the same thing, they didn't have a human space program. When this happened, when these astronauts were presented to the world, it became clear that the Soviet Union had to catch up. They were behind at that point, and they had to catch up. So they developed their own space program, their own human space program, very, very quickly, and they did it in absolute secrecy. So here we have the American program, the Mercury program, which is incredibly highly publicized. Everybody is watching it, including the USSR. And in the USSR, there is a secret program. The plan being to find their own, not astronauts, they call them cosmonauts, which is an interesting distinction, by the way, which I mentioned in my book, Beyond. You know, astronaut is sort of star voyager. Cosmonaut has a slightly more philosophical element. Journey is voyages in the cosmos, and the cosmos is not just a physical space, it's also in a sense a philosophical space as well. It's quite an interesting distinction. And they were training, or began the selection process, around August 1959, so just 3 or 4 months after that press conference when the 7 Mercury astronauts were presented so dramatically and so excitingly to the whole world. I'll leave the picture on for the moment, and I'll just tell you briefly what happened, because I don't have a picture to illustrate this because it was so secretive. But essentially, teams of Soviet doctors went out across Air Force bases, mostly in Western Russia, where they were looking for volunteers from fighter pilots who had essentially what they felt was the right stuff. And the right stuff was not just that they were young, they were fit, they were pilots, fighter pilots, all of them, not test pilots, unlike these guys in America, and also had the right kind of communist credentials, the right kind of political background, which is obviously very important. The KGB were also involved in these selections. They began with 3,461 candidates, many, many, many more than the Americans did for the Mercury program. They didn't tell selected volunteers what actually they were volunteering for. Some people thought it might be helicopters, other it might be some kind of new fighter plane. Very few thought it was going to be space. But people still volunteered, yes, for excitement. Two of those that did so were Yuri Gagarin and Gherman Titov, who were on different fighter bases. They didn't know each other at that point. Out of that 3,461, 134 were sent to a hospital in Moscow, where they were subjected to tests which were far worse even than the ones that were famously, as we know from movies like The Right Stuff and books like The Right Stuff, practiced on the Mercury 7. If you go to the next picture, please. These are some of the tests that they had. These are cosmonauts or cosmonaut candidates being put into a heat chamber where the temperature was racked up to 158 degrees Fahrenheit. And they basically had to stand it as long as they possibly could. Can we go to the next picture? Here he is again. People passed out, you know, and there were all kinds of probes and things on their head to measure how they, and when they finally came through, they were made to do intensive physical exercises afterwards. They were put in centrifuges, which were actually quite dangerous and sometimes broke in a very kind of Soviet way. They were put through vibration tests until their teeth almost fell out. If we go to the next picture, we can see that these were the doctors that they all described as the Gestapo, and there were nurses like them too. If you go to the next picture, here's another image. These are documentary images from these tests, and you can see what some of these people were like. I found these rushes, original raw material actually, in Moscow, and they'd been untouched. They were lying in vaults, in fact, untouched original footage shot in the camera as it was. Which I managed to access and copy for a movie that I was doing at the time, and you know, that you can see what they mean by the Gestapo. If you look at the next picture, this is an altitude pressure test where they're put into a pressure chamber, and then obviously the decompression, the pressure is basically reduced and reduced and reduced to simulate being at very high altitude. And then they have decompression tests there as well. All sorts of things would happen, and you can see the impact on that man's face. Many people passed out. Many people failed the tests. Titov managed to stay in. Everybody in those tests, every candidate was told to say nothing to anybody, including their own wives, about what they were doing. They didn't even know what they were being tested for. But Titov typically broke all the rules and told his wife. And I've got a letter here, which was written on January the 13th, 1960, in which he says, it's one of the wonderful, he calls her Tamarochka. She was pregnant at the time. Sweet Tamarochka, I'm happy to say that the psychologist didn't send me to the madhouse. This means I keep going on the project. Today they irradiated me with ultraviolet rays. By the way, don't show these letters, especially the ones concerning what I'm doing, or talk about them to any outsider. Boys have been dropping off like flies. My little girl, don't be upset, don't miss me. Right now you need more life, more exercise and fresh air. There's 2 of you now, meaning she was pregnant, sending kisses. It's a really sweet letter, totally illegal. He could have ended up in a Siberian camp for saying that if he'd been caught, but somehow he wasn't. And this is typical Titov. And it's one of the things I really like about him, is he breaks the rules. So incredibly, the doctors didn't discover the ankle, the wrist problem where he'd smashed his wrist in the bicycle accident, and he passed along with 19 others. And if you go to the next picture, we'll see those, sorry, forgive me, that was his wife again. The one after that, if you can go to. There they are, all 19 of them. I haven't actually counted, but there should be 19. There are 1 or 2 other people as well that are actually very important in the program there too. It's difficult to explain just how secret this photograph is. You've seen the pictures from Life magazine, the cover, etc., the Mercury astronauts in their spacesuits. This is an absolutely top secret photograph. It wasn't released until many years later. And only then, when they had been passed, were they told what they were passed for, which was to fly in space. Some of them had guessed it, nobody dared speak about it, but now they knew what they were there for. You can see Yuri Gagarin sitting in the front row, and behind him, very small, you can see Gherman Titov. So what was the training that they did? If we go to the next picture, we'll see most of it consisted of athletics, a huge amount of athletics. On the Mercury program, there was almost no athletics. People could exercise as and when they wanted to. People like John Glenn did a lot of that, but that was by choice. In this program, there was masses of exercise, and Titov was very good at it. If we go to the next one, please. He was running. We go to the next one. He was doing all sorts of things there. He was excelling at exercise, running, jumping, squatting, crunching, acrobatics, diving, team games like ice hockey, everything. If we go to the next picture, please. You know, even upside down. He's happiest, it seems to me, when he's upside down. He's always grinning. He was fantastically fit, as they all were. The idea being to produce the 20 fittest men on the planet, and to have 20 of them, because 20 was almost 3 times the 7 of the Mercury 7, because the ambitions of this program were huge at the time. I mean, they even learned how to trampoline. There's a wonderful quote by the head of training, a man called Colonel Karpov, who says, and I quote, "The men are doing some very complicated exercises on trampolines, not up to circus standards perhaps, but their performance is neat, bold and certain." I mean, the insanity of that is extraordinary. I mean, you imagine the head of the Mercury training saying something about how the Mercury 7's trampoline standards were up to circus or nearly up to circus standards. But here, this is what it was all about, to get them to be this fit. And if we go to the next picture, please, we also see them being trained to parachute. This was important because the Vostok capsule in which they would fly would not land in the sea, it would land on the ground, but it couldn't land with a cosmonaut inside it at the time, unlike the Soyuz now today. So the way that it worked was that the cosmonaut would eject from the capsule at a certain altitude once safely inside the atmosphere, and the capsule itself would then essentially parachute down to the ground, and the cosmonaut in his own parachute would also then parachute down to the ground. So they had to learn how to parachute. And if we go to the next picture, we'll see an example of Titov in his parachute. And what's interesting about this is that he was very brave here too. He had one very near fatal accident where his main parachute didn't open. Very near disaster, but he really kept his cool. And as a result of keeping his cool, he landed safely. And this was again something noted by his instructors. This was something that they were extremely impressed with, and rightly so. But he was still questioning everything. He was still a little bit too bourgeois with that teacher that was his father. And that Pushkin thing was still a bit of an issue. And if we go to the next picture, we can see here something called the isolation chamber, a very nasty part of the training in which cosmonauts were routinely put into this hermetically sealed, pressurized chamber and cut off from the outside world completely for so many days. They weren't told how many days it was going to be. That was part of the torture. It was usually around 10 days, where they were sometimes woken up in the middle of the night, but they didn't know what the night or the day was, with shrieks and alarms and all sorts of horrible sounds. It was very frightening. This is one that I photographed myself and I went into. It is, in fact, the isolation chamber that they used. If you look at the next picture, you can see the inside of it. It's not very big and it's very scary. Little portholes. No communication with the outside world at all. You didn't speak to anybody. You didn't see anybody. There were television cameras in there which were filming you. And it was pretty frightening. And some people went crazy in there and had to be, desperately wanted to be let out. What did Titov do? He just quoted chunks of poetry from Pushkin. He just quoted whole plays over and over again. Over 10 days is what he did, which was both extraordinary that he had this sort of memory, and it kept him sane, and it kept him happy, and it kept him amused, it kept him active, if you like, but it also totally perplexes instructors. Again, this strange mix of the kind of courage, the boldness, the excellence, and then this sort of bourgeois, slightly suspicious, slightly suspect intellectual side as well. But he was so good they could not ignore him. And if you look at the next picture, please, he finally got to the last 3 candidates for the first human in space. So we're out of 3,000, what was it, 461. We're down to the last 3. And here they are on a winter's day in Moscow around February of 1961. This photograph was taken. It's part of a film sequence, which again I found in the rushes in this Moscow, deep in this Moscow archive. Totally unknown, these men at this point. You know, nobody's going, my goodness, this is Yuri Gagarin. On the left is Yuri Gagarin. In the middle is Gherman Titov. On the right is a man called Grigory Nelyubov. Nelyubov, who nobody really has heard of today, at one point was a contender for first. He was, again, a very able man. In fact, all 3 of them were in Red Square and in Moscow also to record personal addresses that would be broadcast to the world if they were the first humans in space. They all 3 did their own broadcasts, did their own recordings that were kept on tape for the time they would be used. And of course, the only one that was used was Yuri Gagarin's. Nelyubov's story was terribly sad. He was a somewhat narcissistic personality, and he ended up quarreling in a bar, in a station bar, so badly with a bunch of soldiers that were there that he was finally, because he refused to apologize, kicked off the program. And a few years later, he committed suicide. And he's completely forgotten today. But after being kicked off the program, he was quite literally airbrushed from the program, as if he'd never existed. If we look at the next picture, please, we can actually see that. If you look at the right-hand side, at the top, the 4 men at the top, you'll see standing next to Titov, second from the right is Nelyubov. And if you look at the left picture that was released later to the press, there's no Nelyubov. He's not there. It's fake news. He's gone. He's quite literally been airbrushed from history. And he would have himself seen that photograph shortly before he committed suicide in the late 1960s. He literally went out into the snow and threw himself under a train. It was very Tolstoyan. But let's come back to the 2 that are left in the next picture, if we could. There we are, from the same sequence. There is a smiling Titov, and there is Yuri Gagarin next. These best of friends, they had met on the program when it started in March 1960. And they lived in adjacent apartments that were supplied by the space program. And there was a balcony between their apartments, and they very often used to cross from one side to the other, climb over. It was 4 or 5 stories up, and rather than go all the way down and then up another set of stairs to the next set of apartments, they would literally climb backwards and forwards between their apartments over the balconies. But what really united them, and this again is part of the drama and in a way the pathos of the story, is that Titov had a son who was a few months old, very much the same age as Yuri Gagarin's first daughter, Elena, who I got to know quite well and interviewed for my book. They were both about the same sort of age. But Igor, the son of Titov, died at the age of 7 months from heart complications, and he was absolutely broken by it, as was his wife, Tamara. In fact, Tamara was so broken by it that when I interviewed her for my book, whatever it was, 60 years later or more, she wasn't able to talk about it. Her daughter did, but she couldn't talk about it at all. It was too raw a subject. But incredibly, Yuri Gagarin and his wife Valentina, who had their own little girl, came to their aid and to their succor, if you like, and were the firmest and the most loyal friends. It was extraordinary. And it provided an incredible bond between the 2 families, and an incredible bond between these 2 men, these best of friends, who were also, unfortunately, the greatest of rivals. This is the kind of Shakespearean element in the story. But who would go first? the decision was not made until literally 3 or 4 days before that flight on April the 12th, 1961. So early in April 1961, the men flew to the Cosmodrome. If you go to the next picture, please, of Baikonur in Kazakhstan, which is an extraordinary place which I visited. This is, in fact, the launch pad for the Vostok that flew Yuri Gagarin and subsequently Titov into space. It is enormous. There is this huge fire pit, as you can see, like a crater, which is designed to kind of contain the massive blast from the R-7 rocket that took those men into space and others too. And it's in this extraordinary desert landscape. It's a really bizarre, eerie kind of place. It's very, very, very different from Cape Canaveral. It's about as different as you could possibly get. It's a very strange place. Anyway, they get there in early April. And in the next photograph, please, we can see them playing badminton in front of the barracks that they lived in Baikonur. And this photograph is interesting because this is before April the 12th. So they're playing badminton, more sports. The people there were 6 cosmonauts actually there. They were known as the Vanguard 6, informally and secretly, as opposed to the Mercury 7, the opposition on the other side of the world. They were playing badminton, and you can see Titov actually grinning next to the man holding the bat in the center. And you can see also grinning to the left of him, Yuri Gagarin. This is just a few days before the flight and before the decision had been made. It was a terribly difficult decision. And they were still smiling because both of them thought they might be first. But the choice had to be made. And it was made on April the 8th, 1961. And it's interesting that the man who finally made the choice, but not entirely himself, was a man called Nikolai Kamanin, who also wrote a secret diary at the time. And in the diary on April the 5th, and I quote, he actually says that both of these candidates are very strong, but Titov is maybe stronger and would be therefore better for the much more ambitious second flight in space. And I quote, it's hard to decide which of them should be sent to die. And it's equally hard to decide which of these 2 decent men should be made world famous. Okay? So in one sentence, the risk, which was huge at the time, probably a 50% chance of being killed on this mission. But if you survived, the possibility of being world famous was more than a possibility. It was going to happen. The following day, after the decision was made on April the 9th, Kamanin summoned both of his men into his office in Baikonur, very close to that building, and told them bluntly, without fuss, in the space of a couple of minutes, that Yuri Gagarin was going to go first and that Titov would go second and would be Gagarin's backup in case anything went wrong and was needed. The impact on Titov was tremendous. In one sentence, his whole world was turned upside down. I'll read you something quite interesting. In the autobiography that I mentioned, which is not an autobiography, it's a piece of propaganda, he, but of course it wasn't he, writes this, and again I quote, he said, we all warmly supported the candidature of Yuri Gagarin, who had been nominated by our commanders. This excellent man, an absolute sincere and honest communist, enjoyed well-deserved respect among us cosmonauts. When I was appointed reserve space pilot, I was inexpressibly glad. Well, that's all bollocks. He was utterly devastated. He was devastated. Take a look at the next picture, if we could. Can we get to that? There we go. This is actually a clip from a film that was shot the following day. And there was this huge lunch before Gagarin had flown, which was a celebration of the fact that Gagarin had been chosen, and there was a lot of champagne, and there was some quite sort of exotic foods for the Soviet Union. And a camera picked up this look of Titov. It was just a moment of documentary. It probably shouldn't have been there. I found it. And he keeps that look, that face, for a long, long time. If I showed you the film, which I can't here, you'd be amazed how long it goes on for. If you look at the next picture, you'll see the same thing. There he is, listening to Yuri Gagarin speaking. This is not a man who's delighted what is happening. This is a man whose world has been shattered. by one sentence. And actually, a very remarkable cosmonaut, Ukrainian cosmonaut, who's part of that Vanguard 6 group called Pavel Popovich, saw Titov very shortly after the decision had been made. And I just read this. He said, he being Titov, said to Popovich, and Popovich remembers this, he said, the wound was there for the rest of his life. And Titov said to me, who discovered America? I said, Christopher Columbus. And he said, and who was the second person? And I said, I didn't know. And Titov said, now you understand. Second, Buzz Aldrin, the eternal number 2. These are visual images. These are visual expressions of the impact of that moment, inadvertently captured by propaganda crews who really should never have had this material shown, or they shouldn't have shot it, but it's there and I found it. And it is actually, I think, very revealing. So why was he looked over? Why was Gagarin chosen first? Well, essentially, it was because Yuri Gagarin had the perfect communist biography. His father was a peasant carpenter. Titov's father was a school teacher. All that Pushkin didn't help very much. Gagarin had come from a part of Russia that was more truly Russian than Siberian. Gagarin had 2 healthy daughters by this point, whereas Titov had a dead son. Not a good biography for the man that was going to be the poster boy for communism and for the Soviet way of life in the middle of the Cold War. And then, of course, there was that name, Gherman, as we mentioned before, named after that Pushkin story. Well, Gherman sounds like German, and it was only 16 years since maybe 25 million Soviets had actually been killed or died in the Second World War, what they call the Great, to this day, the Great Patriotic War. Not a good look for a Russian. And above all, what Gagarin had was this inexpressible charm that we can see in the next image. He had a smile that lit up 1,000 faces, and people loved that. And if you want a poster boy for the regime and the ideology that this man represented, Gagarin was a much better example than the more difficult, the more angular, the more problematic, the more rebellious Titov. So Yuri Gagarin takes the flight, and we come to the next image, which is the cottage where these 2 men spent the night. Again, it must have been horrendous because Titov had to do everything that Gagarin was doing just in case. This is the little cottage which I filmed myself, which is right by the launch pad. And if we go to the next image, this is where they spent their last night before Yuri Gagarin flew. They shared the same bedroom. 2 beds, exactly as it was. They had strain gauges underneath the mattresses. They didn't know this at the time, which would be relayed, the signals would be relayed to a bank of gauges in another part of the building. And teams of scientists were watching them through the night to see how much they moved in bed, because if they didn't sleep or they moved too much, that could be a problem for them flying the next day. So here is a man who, Titov is like, is this guy going to sleep very well, or is he not going to sleep very well? Am I going to get this flight? Is there still some last hope of changing the course of history? Next morning, they have their medicals. If you look at the next picture, we can see Yuri Gagarin having his medical, and look at the face of that nurse. Her name is Ada Kotoskaya. She's dead now. I interviewed her before she died. She looks adoringly at Yuri Gagarin. He hasn't flown yet. If you look at the next picture, Titov had his medical, less adoring, okay? And look at his face. It's a different kind of face, isn't it? I think that's a quite revealing image. And then we come to the picture that we started the discussion with, which is the bus. There is Yuri Gagarin on his way to history, and there behind him, wearing the full spacesuit, just in case his spacesuit strung a leak, just in case he fell flat on his face, just in case Yuri Gagarin's blood pressure suddenly went up, just in case he suddenly caught a cold, he tripped on the steps going, any possible thing, accident that might happen, even to the very last moment, he clung to that hope, forlornly as it turned out. Because at 9:07 a.m. on that morning of April the 12th, if we go to our next picture, please, Yuri Gagarin saying Poyakali, which is Russian for let's go, was on his way to space and to eternal fame. And Titov took his suit off in that bus, watched the launch, waited until Yuri Gagarin was in orbit, and then got on a plane with the other 6 cosmonauts that were there in Baikonur to meet him later that night. Gagarin flew once around the world, 108-minute flight, actually 106 minutes, it's somewhat debated. And almost as soon as he'd landed, he had become the most famous man on the planet, the first human being in space. If we go to the next picture, please. There was 3 days later, the biggest party or parade in Russian history. Here is Yuri Gagarin with Khrushchev. It's a wonderful photograph of Khrushchev. Somebody said, I can't remember who it was, I think it was his interpreter, said Khrushchev looked like he'd been given a very wonderful present as well as a very expensive one. And it was a very expensive one, but my God, it worked for them. If you look at the next picture, we see the impact of the crowds on that day of April the 12th, 1961. It's absolutely unbelievable. And much of it was very spontaneous. It was so spontaneous, the KGB was very worried about it. But Khrushchev said, let it be spontaneous. This is a great moment in Soviet history. And in a sense, it was. If we go to the next picture, we see Gagarin posters everywhere. This is taken in Red Square with cheering crowds. And then the next picture, we see the size of the crowds in Red Square, where Yuri Gagarin stood atop Lenin's mausoleum with Khrushchev and the so-called great and good from the Politburo and addressed the crowd. Now, in that crowd was the second cosmonaut, Titov. He didn't go in some special motorcade. He went in a bus. He went in a bus with the other cosmonauts, and he was waving energetically at Yuri Gagarin, who did actually spot him. I think at one point a bunch of the cosmonauts threw him up in the air and he was wearing something yellow, and Gagarin did spot him and pointed Khrushchev's attention to him, but that's as close as he got. Gagarin was a god. That's how he seemed. He was touched by something different. He was his best friend, but now he was something else. He had moved essentially to another sphere. And yet it could have all been so different. It could have been Titov up there. But his turn would come, and when it did, it would be far more dramatic and much more dangerous than Yuri Gagarin. So let's just spin forward to August the 6th, 1961. So now Shepard has flown in space in May 61, and in July 61, Gus Grissom has flown in space. 2 American astronauts, 2 small 15-minute suborbital hops, as I mentioned before. And now it's Titov's turn. And this is a terribly kind of, again, Sovietized image of Titov climbing the steps towards the lift that would take him, the elevator that would take him to the top of the R7 rocket that would take him into space. If you look at the next picture, you'll see another image of him. And what's striking about these images, apart from the fact they're very heavily reworked, as we can see, is that there's no rocket to be seen. And the reason why is that that rocket was essentially the Soviet Union's greatest secret. It was an ICBM which was capable of carrying a thermonuclear warhead all the way to New York. It was known as the R7, and it was absolutely massive. If we look at the next image, you'll see how big it was. So that's an image of the same R7 rocket, not the exact same one, of course, but the same model of rocket or ICBM missile. But this is actually the rocket that would carry a human capsule at the top, a Vostok capsule. When it was first revealed to the public, I think this was in Belgrade, actually, in the late 1960s, so 6 years later. And you can see it's absolutely enormous, much, much bigger than any rocket that the United States had at the time. And they were using actually rather tiny rockets at that time. This is before Saturn. So he gets into the R7 rocket. And in the next image, we have a color image of the launch itself, of that rocket. And on board, sitting at the top in his little spherical Vostok capsule, is Titov, and a photo of his wife, Tamara, which he took with him into space. And he wrote on it, and I've got the actual quote, he said, "To my little Tomochka, nearly all the stars are asking me to send their warmest greetings to you." It's quite sweet, really. What followed was an incredible flight. As I mentioned at the beginning, it was over 25 hours. In fact, it was 25 hours and 18 minutes, 17 and a half orbits, as opposed to Gagarin's 1 or the 2 suborbital flights of Gus Grissom's and Alan Shepard's, a total distance of nearly 450,000 miles. So essentially almost to the moon and back, although obviously it was an orbit of the Earth, or orbits. And there were a number of firsts which have been forgotten. If we go to the next image, we have a sort of artist's impression of the Vostok. So you get a sense of the sphere in which he sat. If we look at the next image, we can see the interior, rather sparse interior of the Vostok, very sparse interior. But this was a fairly remarkable one, because this flight also was the first time anybody, apart from a little bit with Alan Shepard and Gus Grissom, but anybody had properly used manual control in flight. The black box on the left was provided the switches to switch over to manual control. And there's a little kind of joysticky thing, if you see on the right, below what looks like an old car transistor radio, which was his kind of joystick controller that fired little thrusters that enabled him to do a little bit of maneuvering in space. It was very, very simple. So it was the first manual control of a spaceship. It was the first more than one orbit. And also, if we look at the next image, it was the first time anybody had photographed or filmed the Earth from space. A human had filmed it from space. These are actual images of the Earth from August 1961, shot by Titov through his porthole. There's another one next as well. There are many more I could show you. They're all kind of similar, but they have an incredible quality to them and an incredible historical importance when you think these are the very first images of the Earth taken by a human from space. He was also the first person to sleep in space, which he found very difficult to do. He slept for about 8 hours. But most famously, perhaps, if there's any fame in this story, he was the first to suffer from very extreme space adaptation syndrome, or space sickness. And for Titov, it was really bad. It was so bad that there was some consideration about getting him back early. In all the Soviet news bulletins, the word was that he feels great, everything is fantastic, everything is marvelous, as you'd expect. This is Russia after all. Actually, by the 5th orbit, he was so ill he almost fainted, something that was kept a secret for many, many years. And the illness kept going. He managed to sleep, and several hours he slept, but when he woke up, he still felt really ill. I mean, he couldn't function properly. He was so ill. But he began to improve by orbit number 12. And he continued for another 5.5 orbits after that, the 17.5 that I mentioned. He went through 272 sunrises and sunsets. It's incredible, really. August 1961. And after this incredible 25-hour flight, he finally arrived back on terra firma in Russia at 10:18 a.m. on August the 7th in an area of Saratov, which is several hundred miles south of Moscow on the Volga River. In fact, not very far from where Yuri Gagarin landed. But this is where the story becomes a black comedy. And it's just worth dwelling on it just for a moment, because there are no photographs of the landing. The Russians never did that sort of thing. So I'm going to go to the next image and put a picture of Titov up there. There he is in space before he was sick. The next one, if we could, please. That's him. Obviously, a lovely propaganda shot of him. In reality, everything that could possibly go wrong did sort of go wrong. 2 sections of his spacecraft that were supposed to separate didn't separate at first, but eventually they did. When his Vostok capsule got into the Earth's atmosphere and it was time for him to eject, he bashed his nose so badly against the visor of his helmet that his nose started to bleed. He was then ejected and he almost landed on a passing train, and the train actually had to screech to a halt. He managed to avoid the train somehow or other and hit the Earth so badly that the visor actually broke, and he got a mouthful of earth, of mud, of good Russian mud in his mouth. It was a terribly ungainly arrival, made more so by the fact that there was a female driver that had seen that parachute coming down, had been listening on the radio, realized that here in the whole of the Soviet Union was the man himself on his way back from space. She was so excited that she swerved off the road and her car hit a pothole. The car crashed. She banged her head on the steering wheel, and he staggered over to her with his broken visor and his mouthful of good Russian soil, had to find his own first aid kit and actually give her first aid bandages because she was bleeding all over her face. This was Titov's arrival back on Earth after 25 hours and 272 sunsets and sunrises. This is how he arrived back. It is so gloriously and madly Russian and entirely different from the much more choreographed, live televised splashdown affairs that we're much more used to, even with the Mercury landings in the sea. Here is a cosmonaut with his face absolutely filled with mud and now hasn't got his own first aid kit. But if we go to the next picture, he got his moment of glory. Here he is making his phone call to Khrushchev, the premier. This is part of the rite of passage. Clearly very excited shortly after that event that I described. And he got his Red Square treatment. If we just go to the next picture, we can see him in the car, not a very clear picture, with a not smiling Tamara, all this fame that had suddenly hit her. And Khrushchev is in the car as well with his hand up just to the left. It wasn't quite such a big event as Yuri Gagarin's, but it was an event. And we can look at the next picture and you see it there as well. Him having to sign lots of autographs. In fact, you can't see him because you just see his head, but he is, trust me, signing autographs down at the bottom of that picture. And now we come just to the last bit of the story, which was that, yes, there was fame of a sort, but the aftermath, as it was with Buzz Aldrin to a certain extent, had its tragicomic and actually more tragic elements. Like Yuri Gagarin, he went all over the world promoting his flight, in a sense promoting the ideology which created that flight for him. If you look at the next picture, we can see him in Berlin. This is just after the wall was put up. The wall was put up only 6 days after after he landed, incredibly. I mean, we are right in the height of the Cold War. The next picture after that, we can see him with Ho Chi Minh as well. So right in the middle of the Vietnam, well, actually not right in the middle. The Vietnam War was just building at that point. It hadn't really started, but it was definitely on the development. And he even, unlike Yuri Gagarin, who only went once to the United States, the United Nations, to address it in New York, he went on a very unsuccessful tour of the United States. If you look at the next picture, he went with his wife. There they are at Berkeley, with Titov characteristically looking down. The press absolutely hated him. He made jokes about the Washington Monument, saying it wasn't very big. He said the skyscrapers were not very impressive. He was booed by traders on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange. He ridiculed pictures at the Museum of Modern Art in New York City. And he said that neon signs were repulsive. It wasn't a great start. It was a very unsuccessful tour. One knows that Yuri Gagarin would have done it way, way better. He did, however, meet Kennedy and John Glenn, if we go to the next picture, who had, in fact, Glenn had just flown his own first orbital flight in February of 1962. So this is May 1962. There's a slightly uncomfortable looking JFK in the middle, a rather short Titov, and there on the left is Glenn. And I think probably the most famous thing about his relationship with Glenn was an impromptu barbecue that they had, where they both nearly set fire to the barbecue and to themselves. And it was only just very, 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 very rapidly and quickly put out because it could have set the whole thing up in flames, which I think is a sort of an interesting metaphor on the Cold War at the time, given that just 5 months later, we have in October 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis. Things for Titov began to turn really quite sour. The temptations of fame were too much. If you look at the next picture of Yuri Gagarin, you can see the faces. In fact, that's the actress Gina Lollobrigida. But the face, with the temptations of women, wine, song, alcohol, parties were absolutely huge. And it sort of really destroyed, in some ways, both of them. Titov was interested in fast cars, parties, women, drinking. His marriage became very rocky. In 1964, there was an accident with a female passenger. We don't know what kind of relationship he was having with her. Was it an affair? There was a car accident. He was drunk. She was killed in the car. And Titov fled the scene of the crime. And there was no case. The whole thing was covered up by the Soviet authorities. He was just too famous. He was just too valuable. It would represent a blight on the USSR at a very critical political time in history. The whole thing was hushed up, kept quiet. Well, we all know about fake news. We all know what Russia does when it comes to the truth. It murders it. And this was an example of just exactly that. But Titov had done a terrible thing. And if you look at the next picture, it did put massive strain on his marriage. This is a propaganda picture. They did have a new family, but there were definitely strains in the relationship, as you could well imagine. He was struggling with himself. He was struggling with alcohol. He was struggling with being second. He was struggling with his own demons. By this point, Yuri Gagarin also was struggling. He'd been banned from spaceflight because he was too important to lose. Titov incredibly managed to stay on the space program and worked on a rather advanced project. We go to the next picture, called Spiral, which is really advanced for its time. It was a kind of mini space shuttle in the mid-1960s. But he never flew in space again. And after Yuri Gagarin had been killed in a mysterious plane crash in 1968, Titov never flew at all. As a pilot again. By the end of the decade, he'd had several car accidents. He'd had at least 10 serious disciplinary incidents. His life was going to shit, basically. And if you look at the next picture, you can see physically he was changing quite fast, thickening out, probably from the drink. He became director of the Office of Space Facilities from 1972 until he retired in 1992. But the drinking seems to have continued. The good looks that he'd had were fading. And there are elements of, again, buzz here too, with psychological difficulties, drinking problems, affairs. That moment in April 1961 had its impact down the decades. And meanwhile, after Yuri Gagarin's death in 68, he had to contend with a massive Gagarin personality cult in the Soviet Union and later on in Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union. If you look at the next picture, we can see in Moscow itself, as I photographed this, I think, this is the Yuri Gagarin statue, which is absolutely enormous in this Gagarin square, made of titanium that dominates the city in some ways, or the area. It's absolutely huge, this heroic Yuri Gagarin. No such statues like that for Gherman Titov. If you look at the next photograph, Yuri Gagarin's car was hermetically packed and sealed and put inside. Sorry? Was put inside, so I just heard somebody there, was put inside this extraordinary glass cage that would last forever. The Russians love doing this. They do it with Lenin, and they did it with this car as well. They do it with all their so-called saints. No such cars for Titov. He crashed most of them anyway, so then none of them were put in anywhere at all. There were 7 museums in Gagarin's hometown of Gzhatsk, which was changed, the name of which was changed to Gagarin. But for Titov, there was nothing named after him. No museums like that in his own hometown, or not as many. I think there was one. And certainly his birthplace was not renamed Titov. So all of that he had to witness, all of that fame, all of that glory, all of that specialness, all of that godlike sanctity he had to witness in his great rival and also his great friend as he sank into some sort of alcoholic despair, I suppose. And if you look at the next picture, we see him towards the end of his life, almost unrecognizable, but he's only in his 60s, early 60s there, actually. He died from a heart attack, aged just 65, in September 2000. He was actually, again, tragically, he died in his sauna in his apartment, but he was dead for a day before he was discovered, leaving behind his wife, Tamara, and his 2 daughters. Today, if he's remembered at all, it is as cosmonaut number 2, but he is remembered to a certain extent in Russia, I suspect hardly at all anywhere else except by people who are enthusiasts for this sort of history. A man beset by demons and who did some bad things, particularly after the fall from grace, if you like. But he achieved, we must remember, some great things too. And his flight was incredibly bold and advanced for its time. He was brave. And there were many great firsts there. And his wife, I just want to leave on this, told me really personally when I interviewed her in Moscow, that really his greatest quality was his honesty, which was sometimes very blunt, often career damaging, and often self-laceratingly so, perhaps never more so than in one of the very last interviews he ever gave before he died, when he turned to the subject which had dominated his existence since the day in April 1961 when Yuri Gagarin was chosen over him. And he said this, and I think it's quite moving. He said, "Yuri turned out to be the man everyone loved. Me, they couldn't love. I'm not lovable. I'm telling you, they were right to choose Yuri." And that's my talk. Thank you.
Boy, you were right. That really is a Shakespearean tragedy. Oh my goodness. I do have a couple questions for you.
Yeah, go for it. Yeah.
So the first question I have, I'm fascinated about what you found out about his motion sickness. I mean, what I've read, what's the predominant thing in the literature is that he had a sensation of flying upside down before he felt nauseated. But it's never gone beyond that, that he became quite ill. How did you uncover that information? I'm very curious.
Well, a lot of it actually came from his own wife, actually. And a lot of it also came from two of the cosmonauts that I interviewed, who at the time was still alive and part of the cosmonaut group, the original 20 group. Um, and I think there's also references to it. I would have to check this. I'm pretty sure there are references to it in Kamanin's secret diary. And Nikolai Kamanin was a guy who was basically in charge of this program. And he kept this very secret diary, which, had it been discovered at the time, would have landed him probably in the gulag. Um, and it's very candid. I mean, I quote from it quite a lot in my book, but he, I think, refers to it there as well. I can't quite remember. I'd have to check that, but I'm pretty sure that he also refers to it. So it was referred to, but it was obviously kept very secret because this is not the image they wanted to present of the heroic cosmonaut. But it was, nobody knew this would happen. Nobody had the idea that you could become, but of course, all your vestibular systems are just thrown upside down and all over the place because you are essentially in free fall. That's what it is, as we all know. People think of it as kind of zero, there's no gravity up there, but it's not at all that. But you are falling around the world, but you never reach it. So in that state of free fall, your vestibular mechanisms become confused. And for some people, as we know very well now, it's very, very well documented, that can cause considerable sickness. There had been examples of people being ill when they took the sort of vomit comet, when they did kind of parabolas in aircraft, in jet aircraft, that briefly simulated those same effects of free fall, of weightlessness, but not to the point where it was going to become a real problem for flight. So this was really the first long-term flight. It was a long time before anybody flew that much again, that long in space. And so it was invaluable to see what space or space flight could do to some human bodies. And in a way, it's rather tragic that the Soviets are so secretive about this stuff, as they were about so many things, because in the world of spaceflight, a kind of a communal joining of information, a sharing of this sort of knowledge is incredibly important. I mean, I've always felt that those astronauts that were killed in the fire on Apollo 1 might not have been killed had the story of one of the candidates, one of the cosmonauts who actually was burned to death in that horrible isolation chamber, that pressurized chamber, if that story had come out, that how easy it is for this stuff to catch fire in this oxygen-rich environment, and what happens when you can't get out. I mean, this guy was killed. He died of burns, horrific burns, a man called Bondarenko. Well, almost exactly the same thing happened with those astronauts, including, of course, Gus Grissom, in Apollo 1. Would that necessarily have happened had all that information been out there? But this is the Cold War. Secrets are being kept actually on both sides, but more so on the Soviet side. And nobody ever knows. And the same thing applies for the for the space adaptation syndrome, for the sickness thing as well. But it was documented internally. And certainly I was being told this by people that were on the program at the time. and also, of course, by his own wife.
Yeah, that's very interesting. By the way, I don't know if you know, but there is a new book being written about Apollo 1.
Okay.
So uh, we've actually had the two authors speak on this webinar. So if you have interest, that was in January, I think it was this year.
Great,
I have
great.
that on YouTube if you're interested in seeing that.
Yeah, yeah, I'd love to see that. Do you know when the book's coming out?
I know they were looking for a publisher. I think they found a publisher, and I don't know if you know if they have a publisher.
They did not have a publisher as of April, but I will find out in 2 weeks.
Okay.
Right. Well, good luck to that. I mean, it's an amazing story and a horribly tragic story as well.
Yeah.
What I'm saying is certain deaths might not have happened had information been shared as they were. But but it was a remarkable thing that he um, survived it because it was incredibly bad. I mean, it really, really was. He wasn't actually able to function for several orbits. He was amazingly finally able to get to sleep. I don't to this day know whether they had any kind of tranquilizers or anything like that. Maybe somebody here would know that. I ought to know because, I've done a lot of work on this area. But he was able to get some sort of sleep. He found it quite difficult to sleep. He kept slipping under his straps. I know that in that weightless conditions. But he was able to sleep. But yet, as I think I mentioned in the talk, when he came up from sleep, when he woke up from his sleep, he was still very, very ill. But then miraculously, as his vestibular mechanisms adapted to the environment, no doubt, he began to feel better. And he was able then to function well for the last 5 orbits.
Amazing. One other thing too, that's kind of funny. You mentioned that when he landed
Yeah.
and he hit the ground with the helmet and I think you said he had a gash on his nose.
He had a
You
gash on his
can't,
nose.
you can't see the gash in the picture though, when
No,
he's,
no. He had a gash on his nose, and also that you just with the picture that you see when he's making the phone call,
yeah,
that almost certainly would have been airbrushed if there was something there. I mean, that would have been a picture. That was a picture released to the public, right? Everything that you're seeing there, that's Pravda. Everything is. I mean, there's a famous story of Yuri Gagarin who was caught in bed with a chambermaid, and when he was on holiday with his wife. After he'd become very famous, or at least he tried to go to bed with his chambermaid, and he leapt out of the window, which was 2 floors up in this incredibly sort of exclusive resort on the Black Sea, and smashed onto the pavement. His eye was completely dinged in. He had a massive gash above his head. He went to hospital, had surgery. All future images of him that you can see there's a gash, but it's essentially airbrush. It's kind of photoshopped in its own way out. And the story that went out to the press was that, in fact, his wife lost control of their baby and he dived to catch the baby. And in diving to catch the baby, he hit his own head. When in fact, what had happened was he'd leapt, his wife was on the warpath and he leapt out of a 2nd floor apartment window and hit the floor.
oh
I
my
mean,
God.
this is what happens. I mean, well, we see this happening in every world. It happens all the time. It's the political elites covering for themselves. These men were too valuable. And the most egregious example of that is what Titov did in 1964 when he had a drunk drive accident and his companion was killed.
Yeah, his own Chappaquiddick.
Yeah, its own Chappaquiddick. Exactly. Exactly right.
Wow.
Yeah.
I did have a question in chat. The question was, why did the Soviets elect to choose a non-pilot for the first female cosmonaut? Of course, Valentina Tereshkova. Do you happen to know that?
For Tereshkova,
Yeah.
do I
Why
know
was
that?
she
I don't know very much about Tereshkova, except that she's completely ghastly, and still is a huge Putin supporter. And if you know that, I mean, massively so. Um, I know that there were a number of candidates. One of whom was Popovich's wife, who was a fighter, not a fighter pilot. She'd actually been a test pilot. She was much more suited to this, but was considered to be very, very much more suited to become the first female Soviet cosmonaut. But she was very, again, a bit like Titov. She was difficult. She was incredibly talented. She was a brilliant pilot. She was outspoken. She spoke her mind. They wanted somebody submissive who would do what she was told, and they decided to choose Tereshkova. And I don't know how the selection process happened, but what I do know is that there was everything in those capsules, of course, was automated, and it was incredibly easy to. It was actually incredibly easy to fly this thing because all you actually had to do was to sit in it. The
And
fact
then
that
just
Titov
parachute
actually
out.
took over manual control was a minor thing. They just wanted to see whether this thing would actually work or not. And even the level of control it had was far less than existed on the Mercury capsules. Far less. It was incredibly primitive. So she didn't need to do anything at all. But she wasn't a pilot. I think somebody just mentioned that she was a parachutist. I think I saw a line go. I think that's correct from memory. But she didn't fly planes in the way that Marina Popovich was a fantastic pilot. I mean, really better, in fact, than quite a lot of the cosmonauts. And in fact, much more experienced than Yuri Gagarin, who wasn't actually a very experienced pilot, in fact.
Interesting. Wanted to open it up for anyone else that may have some questions.
I can't
I
find
have
it.
one, Stephen.
Yeah.
When you were doing your research, did you feel that you were being watched or everybody was open to you during your research over there? Did you feel comfortable doing all this research and the stuff you were pulling out, which is amazing?
Do you know, it's a great question. So the research is divided into two parts. I was originally going to do this as a movie, as a feature-length documentary for the theatre, for the cinemas, as we call it here. I had money from essentially Universal to go and do that. When I started doing the research for this back in 2014, I was interviewing quite a few cosmonauts who've since sadly passed, some really quite key ones actually. The door was open, and then it gradually started to change. This was their history, and here I was, an outsider with Hollywood money coming in, and what was I doing telling their story? And was I going to do something which was anti-Russian? Was it going to be American money? All of that stuff. What began to happen was, as I was beginning to dig around in those archives, and that footage I showed you, which was actually quite amazing, I did actually create a 30-minute taster of it. I was discovering that it was getting harder and harder to remove material, to copy material. At one point, my brilliant Russian archivist was basically guarded by soldiers with submachine guns in the archives.
Oh my.
Not something you expect to find in the National Archives in Washington or elsewhere. There was a lot of that starting to happen. But I had a very good Russian researcher for the book, who actually is based in London, and I'd worked with on the BBC, and she had made films about Gorbachev. She got to know Gorbachev very well. I'd worked with her before. She was really terrific, and she was able to kind of ease the passage. But there was still, there were definitely some suspicions, and there were things I wasn't allowed to do. I mean, I remember there's a sort of museum which is only open to certain select sort of elite Russians, containing very key artifacts from the space era. It's not open to the public. It was extremely difficult for me to get access to it. I did finally get access to it, but even then there were certain entrances I wasn't allowed in because I wasn't Russian. I didn't have a Russian passport, obviously. I had a British passport, so they wouldn't let me in. And in Kazakhstan, at the Baikonur launch site, which is also a missile site, though much less so, and actually not at all now, but there were some very secretive areas on Baikonur, and the guides just lost their rag with me because I went off grid. I left the tour and started to go somewhere else on my own, doing my own independent research and talking to people, and they went absolutely apeshit with me for doing that. I mean, I thought I was going to get kicked off the tour. You never do that. You stay with us. So there, I was definitely being watched. Yeah, I was. Yeah.
And the last comment I want to make is, we were talking about the air sickness. I'm sure today they know how to screen people now and training and stuff like that. So people that are susceptible to that either go through desensitization or they're out of the program. Because I'm sure we
Actually,
kind of
I'm
took
not sure
care of
that's
that.
entirely the case, actually. I mean, I wrote a piece for a big newspaper here called The Guardian. In fact, I think it's available. It's international, so you can probably find it. But I wrote a piece about the International Space Station, quite a big sort of 5,000 word feature a year or two ago, actually, about the ISS. And I talked to a lot of people, including, ex heads of NASA and others. And they were saying to, and other many astronauts who'd actually flown on the space station, the International Space Station, ex-NASA and others from the European Space Agency, and in fact one Russian as well, who agreed to talk to me despite the fact that the war with Ukraine had already started. But you know what? It still happens.
Yeah.
People still get sick up there. You can do everything. You can adapt people out of things. You can do masses of training, and it looks fine. And you get up there, and you're sick. And it just happens still.
Yeah, there's no way to really predict it either. They've attempted to do that. There's no way to really predict it. And in fact, there's some sense as well that if you do get sick and you treat it, that it may prolong your adaptation as well. But very commonly they'll be given promethazine to actually treat it. They used to use something called a combination of scopolamine and dexedrine. But that was sort of phased out for use of promethazine, which actually started like around STS 25.
Right. That's very interesting. Yeah, I do remember one of the astronauts saying that the medication was changed. I do remember that, but he wasn't as specific as you were. That's very interesting about the actual medication that was changed. So yeah, I mean it's a very big problem. It's not quite the same as, say, I mean I have a pilot's license, I was saying earlier on. I get very sick if I fly aerobatics, which I don't do. It just makes me really sick. If you keep doing it, apparently it does make it feel better. It's never worked for me. I'm always feeling sick if I'm flying myself. I also scare myself rotten, so I don't do it, or passengers. But so, these things can to a certain extent, but not entirely, in which case medication can sometimes help. But you just don't know if it's going to happen to you or not. But in Titov's time, there was nothing. They didn't even know this was going to happen. They had no idea it was going to happen. But it almost destroyed the mission. What's interesting, of course, is that the news bulletins from Russia, all the way through that mission, because they started once he was there, they never, ever, ever released a news bulletin until the guy was safely in orbit. The same with Yuri Gagarin. Everything. So if you get blown up on the launch pad, you don't exist. You just don't exist. You're anonymous. You never were, right? Once you're up there, then the news is released. And then the news is released a lot. But of course, the news that the cosmonaut, the heroic Soviet cosmonaut, was actually being really sick and feeling awful as he circled the Earth, that bit was not released, and not for years.
Thank you.
Yeah, poor guy. Well, I love Titov. I've always thought he had a great story and just the wild man of the cosmonaut crew. But it's tragic what happened to him.
He was. I mean, apart from that awful sort of downturn at the end and some of the things, there is something about his sort of, I mean, I love the idea of him quoting Pushkin all day long in the isolation chamber. I mean, you can imagine with these hard-bitten Soviet doctors, like, what was this guy doing? And yet it got him through those 10 days and he survived. And they just couldn't get rid of him because he was actually very good and he was bloody intelligent. He really was, and knew it, which is also part of the problem. Yeah. Whereas Yuri Gagarin was just the smiler. He was good at everything. Everybody loved him. He didn't cause offense to anybody. As Titov said at the end, he was the right choice. They all loved him. They didn't love me.
Well, with that, I think we're really almost at time, and I know it's very late for you, and you've indulged us once again with a wonderful talk and very.
I can't see the chat here, actually, Ellen. I can't see it. I don't know why it's not coming up here. I can't see
actually, there's nothing else in the chat. Although a couple of people did say they thought Beyond was a fabulous book and highly recommended it.
Well, that's wonderful. Yeah, do buy it. I hope it's a good read. Well, that's an arrogant thing for me to say, but
no, it's fabulous, and the audiobook is great too. I've listened to it by audiobook. So
thank you. Yeah, no, wonderful. Well, I really enjoyed talking to you guys, and it was certainly worth staying up for. I always enjoy coming and talking to your group and your organization, which I think is magnificent. And I also want to say I was incredibly moved, by the way, before I leave, I was very moved by what you said about that young man that was killed in Ukraine. That was terribly moving to me. And, I wish his family well. I mean, what an awful thing to have happened.
Oh, yeah. I was shocked when his mother called me on Monday to tell me.
Yeah, that's just awful. I only wish he was here to hear this tonight, but sadly not. But thank you all, and thank you for being patient with me and for listening. And I hope I'll come back one day with another story at some point. We'll have to come and think of something, won't we?
Oh, yes. Well, you're always welcome. So thank you again. Have a good evening, and good evening, everyone.
Thank you. Good night, all.
Thank
All
you,
righty.
Susan.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you
Well
very much.
done.